Sung is a South Korean who has been held in Taejon prison south of the capital, Seoul, for the last 17 years.
Carlos Bosch is a 17-year-old street child from Guatemala City. On June 5th this year, he disappeared. At 10 o'clock that morning...
Andreas Christodoulou is tonight in prison in Greece because he refuses to kill another human being. He is a 20-year-old Jehovah's Witness and a conscientious objector...
Tonight in Delhi, Shabir Shah is in prison. His repeated arrests and his reputation as a moderate political leader have made him a hero in Kashmir. Thousands of people poured onto the streets after his arrest.
These were some of the cases I featured in 5 years of television programs called Prisoners of Conscience, or presented by well-known people. In my long career as a filmmaker, I've returned to the theme of human rights again and again. So it was with the help of Amnesty International and other human rights groups that in 1988 I began to produce my first series of short, 5-minute appeals that told the stories of people from all over the world who were unjustly imprisoned. Some were under threat, some had been tortured, some were in solitary confinement, others had simply disappeared.
If they don't kill them, they disappear them instead, and disappearances usually mean death. The story of Tarcisio, a 21-year-old student in Colombia, is only too familiar for many Latin Americans today.
These programs were broadcast every year around the 10th of December, Human Rights Day. They featured students, lecturers, trade unionists.
Until recently, the killing and disappearing of trades union leaders in Peru was rare, but this has changed since guerrilla groups...
Lawyers, scientists, politicians.
Ali Ardalan became involved with a political organization which called for a democratic Iran. But by June this year, he was once again under arrest, this time for signing...
Artists, scholars, writers.
Tang Min was sent for trial. It was the first time in China that fiction had been challenged under the libel laws.
Religious people.
Yulu Dawa Tsering is a Buddhist monk. Today he is doing 10 years for what he is supposed to have said over dinner.
And even ordinary people who'd become victims of government oppression.
Henrik Joker is a car mechanic from the capital, Tirana. This is the only photograph we have of him. None other exists. His story goes like this.
I was fortunate that so many high-profile figures who ranged from former Prime Minister James Callaghan...
One such prisoner is Mikhail Kukabaka.
...to the comedian John Cleese agreed to present the programmes.
This Tibetan doctor is serving a 13-year sentence for the simple reason that he copied out the names of people arrested or injured during a demonstration.
So in the 25 years that has passed since I started, I wanted to find out what has happened to some of these prisoners of conscience. When were they released? How did their experiences shape them? What have they gone on to do with their lives? And how has the landscape changed for prisoners of conscience and human rights around the world?
When people get into power, whether it's in governments or increasingly also corporations, they go to any lengths to retain that power and to abuse the power. So, unfortunately, that has not changed.
There are as many people today, if not more, who are prisoners of conscience. The definition stands today as a legitimate, proper definition. Prisoners of conscience have not disappeared. It is as live a subject today as it was when you made that series.
I think my real concern was that people should know what was happening.
My inspiration for the series came from reading the journalist Caroline Moorhead's column, who every week in The Times featured a different prisoner of conscience, by which I mean someone who was innocent and did not advocate violence.
I think my real feeling was that we all live these very comfortable lives and we don't actually know what people are doing and what people are putting up with. So I think I felt about it what I feel about all the sort of things I write. It really is in order to say to people, you know, hang on a bit, this sort of stuff is going on out there. Maybe when you next go to these countries you will say to yourself, I wonder what's happening here. I really only saw what I was doing as the informing bit. But actually the sort of witness element of storytelling has always been the bit that I saw myself having some part in.
But I wanted to go further. I wanted to compel the audience not to look away, to want to do something. So I persuaded Caroline to help turn her column into a television series for BBC Two. She was writer and researcher, and eventually my co-producer.
People used to also send us photographs I particularly remember the day when at the BBC a brown envelope arrived and I opened it and it was a wodge of what looked initially like Happy Holiday snaps. And I said, Rex, look. And I remember you came over, I remember where I was standing, and I said, just look at these pictures. There must have been 50 of them. And at first we looked in and we thought, well, maybe they're having a party, you know. And then suddenly we realised what in fact it was.
One person or several people being tortured?
One person being tortured.
God. Who would have taken photographs of that? One of the guards?
Surely one of the guards.
Yeah. Do you remember which country it was from?
I think it was Iraq.
I hadn't remembered that. One person or several people being tortured?
One person being tortured.
At the end of the programmes, our audience was asked to ring or write to receive more information on the prisoner, on his or her prison, and the government ultimately responsible for their imprisonment. People then called in their several thousands for information packs on individual cases.
If you would like to help Reverend Emundi, please send a stamped addressed envelope to Prisoners of Conscience, BBC.
What we were doing, Caroline, was actually pushing to the limits the whole stance of the BBC's objectivity, if you like.
Yes.
Because we were saying to people, what are you going to do? Sit at home and just watch them? No, we're going to give you an opportunity to write or ring in.
But that's what made it so exciting, was that so many people did want to know more.
I think in hindsight, we probably crossed the line in terms of the BBC's policy on not being seen to campaign. But I felt we had to encourage viewers to act against unjust imprisonment, ill-treatment and torture that our programmes revealed night after night. Academic and human rights lawyer Philippe Sands watched the series at the time.
There were many people who watched it, there were many people who heard about it, it generated news stories, and it generated responses directly to certain governments. The campaigning and the political issue is a complicated one. I mean, there would be an interesting question as to whether you could permit yourself to include, if you were to be running that programme today, someone who either was detained by the British government or someone whose detention by a third government had been assisted in some way by the complicity of the British government. And would you have the British government coming down on you like a ton of bricks for putting the spotlight on someone who was handed over, for example, to the Gaddafi regime in Libya or to the Americans at Guantanamo or to some other place? Could you or could you not get involved in that?
I would like to think we could and should have tried. So who have we found from our original series of Prisoners of Conscience? Let us begin with a story from Africa, where we featured 12 cases. Here's the playwright, Tom Stoppard.
This is about Jack Mapanji, a poet from Malawi in Central Africa. He is now in jail there, and has been for the last 15 months, for no special reason, or rather for the usual reason poets get put in jail. That's always been the extreme compliment paid by politics to poetry.
I was at the Gymkhana Club in Malawi. The police came and they said, "Are you Jack Mapanji?" I said, "Yes." And the inspector of police simply said, "We've been directed by His Excellency the Life President to arrest you and detain you."
But someone evidently decided Mapanji's verse was too serious to be ignored.
I was summoned to a round table type of court where the head of the table was the Inspector General, and there were about 8 commissioners of police around the table, and he said, "Well, what we have decided to do is to ask you, why do you think we should arrest you and detain you?" I almost laughed, but this was no laughing matter at all. I had been put through a lot of rigmarole, and here I was being asked why they should, why I should be arrested.
Politics in Malawi have been dominated in recent years by the question who is to succeed President Hastings Banda, who has been in charge for 3 decades. Mapanji is being held under a detention order signed by President Banda.
But how extraordinary for this group of policemen to ask you, why are they detaining you?
Absolutely.
That's straight from Kafka, is it not?
Well, it is the most Kafkaish thing that ever happened. I'm sitting there and I'm shivering for my life because what is going to happen to me? Are they going to kill me? And so on and so forth.
And once he gives an order, An order is an order.
An order is an order. There's no way you can defend yourself. There's no lawyer I could refer to. I simply just sat there, shocked and frozen.
And how long were you in prison?
For 3 years, 7 months, 16 days, and a little over 12 hours.
But looking back, you must have made enemies, because you were a well-known poet in Malawi, weren't you?
I was, yes.
Yeah, you were a well-known figure, a public figure, correct?
Yes.
Had you criticized the dictatorship? Had you lent your name to any open letter or things like that?
The strange thing is, whatever I was doing surreptitiously. In dictatorships, it's very easy to make enemies.
In Malawi, freedom of speech is very limited and political comment dangerous. Mapanji's verse, which is by no means all political, has dealt increasingly with subjects like torture, deportations, summary executions, and relations with South Africa. Some of Mapanji's recent and more outspoken poems had been circulating in the days before his arrest. He has often been described as the conscience of his country, and some of his sayings are so widely quoted.
I wrote poems in my head. I wrote 25 of them.
Do you have one with you, Jack? Do you remember one?
Well, I remember one, yeah. This one called Scribing the Furious Wars of Mikuyu. Do you want me to read it?
Please read it to us, yes.
Is this where they dump those rebels? These haggard cells stinking of bucket shit and vomit and acrid urine of yesteryears. Who would have thought I would be gazing at these dusty cobweb ceilings of Mikuyu prison, scrubbing briny walls and riddling out impetuous scratches of another dung beetle locked up before me here.
What justice!
Violent human palm. This is the moment we dreaded, when we would all descend into the pit, alone, without a wife or a child, without mother, without paper or pencil, without a story, just 3 Bibles for 90 men, without charge, without trial. This is the moment I never needed to see. Prison. No, I will throw my water and mop elsewhere. We have liquidated too many brave names out of the nation's memory. I will not rub out another, nor inscribe my own, more ignoble, to consummate this moment of truth I have always feared. The truth was, I survived, among other reasons, is because I said there was a God there. And for those who believed that there was a God, prayer was the most important thing. And that's how we survived, through prayer.
On all the evidence, Mapanji's only crime was that he got up somebody's nose, the crime for which people are put in jail all over the expanding universe of casual injustice. What is one supposed to do? Sometimes the most one can do is to assure both the jailers and the jailed that out of sight is not out of mind. The least we can do is not to shrug.
I'm not sure if we played any part at all in your release, because it was the arbitrary nature of this dictator who decided to let you go. But maybe or maybe not, we had some impact. Who knows?
Well, I think you had some impact. In fact, everybody who campaigned for my release had some impact. The thing about dictators is you do not know which one is going to listen to.
Fearing for his life, Jack Mapanji left Malawi soon after his release and came to the UK to pursue a successful academic career and continue writing his poetry. Jack's story raised the question for me of how much impact we actually had on getting people released. Of course, it's impossible to say for sure, to quantify exactly, for many of the cases we covered. But I've discovered that we did make a difference with one prisoner of conscience in particular. In 1988, Dame Peggy Ashcroft presented the case of a Somalian biochemist called Safia Hashi Madar.
In the Horn of Africa. She is the mother of a 6-year-old boy, Ahmet. She was 9 months pregnant with a second child when, in the middle of one night in July 1985, police broke into her house. They took her to the security headquarters. There she was questioned for many hours about possible links with the Somali National Movement, which leads the armed opposition to the government.
Safia became the victim of arbitrary arrest by the government of President Siad Barre. She had not committed any crime.
Just 3-4 days later, I had my baby.
In prison?
In prison. But they take to the hospital.
They took you to a hospital?
To have the baby, and then came back, and then they separated me and baby. And
what happened to your baby?
They handed it to my mom. So it was very sad, and I just bless my God, Allah, all the time. I pray the good thing will happen. One day will be a change. My father taught me, if you will be patient, you will be winner. And if you don't revenge, never ever revenge,
After 10 months solitary detention, Safia was brought to trial. She was not allowed a defense lawyer and was charged with participating in a subversive organization.
They gave me life imprisonment. The security men, they went to kill us.
In the 1980s, the Somali military murdered large numbers of unarmed civilians from Safia's ethnic group in Somaliland. Safia was kicked and choked, beaten with sticks and burned with cigarettes. We also reported that she had been raped, but she says that we got that wrong.
No, it wasn't happen. No, not at all.
It didn't happen?
It didn't happen. It happened some of my other colleagues, maybe later on when they've been questioning, but not me.
The international campaign for Safia's release, to which our programme contributed to, began to make an impact. Safia began to receive letters and postcards in Somalia's Hargeisa prison. How did you feel then when they actually gave you these postcards, which may have come from our programme, may have been other Amnesty and other organisations, written by people whom you've never met and will never know, asking for your release? What did that mean to you?
I feel that I am not alone. The head of the prison, he told me, Amnesty International and PPC, how they get your information. I said, I don't know. I said, all the while talking about you, all the time.
You're in the news.
You had been, all news, BBC News, everything. And I said, because I'm innocent.
The pressure mounted so much that Safia was transferred to a prison in Mogadishu. She was then taken to an extraordinary meeting with President Siad Barre himself.
He told me he's embarrassed. Yeah.
He actually said that to you?
Yes. He said, why? Why you being famous, I said, I don't know. Because if I said I'm innocent, I was frightened because I'm not released, not yet.
You were in his office?
But they don't tell me that I'm going out.
You must have been terrified being taken to see this man who was the president of this country, creating so many human rights violations, abuses. There you are in his office.
Yeah.
And he then let you go.
And he said, you're free.
After Safia was released, she came to the UK and was given asylum. She continues her work here as a biochemist, supports her children through their education, and dreams of one day returning to an independent Somaliland. So it did matter to her that thousands wrote and campaigned for her release, a riposte perhaps to the notion that regimes do not ever respond to bad publicity. And why should people be involved in human rights? As the world moved on.
Why should people care about this? People should care about this because human rights touches each and every person who's listening to this program in direct and indirect ways. And that's one of the things that we have learned, is that violations of fundamental human rights in seemingly faraway places have local consequences elsewhere. Look at what is going on right now in Syria. We find ourselves in a position of real difficulty because there are terrible abuses of human rights taking place now in the Syrian conflict, no doubt on both sides, and we find ourselves powerless to do anything about it. And that too has a sort of corrosive effect.
Fatima Abbas is a hostage. She's in prison in Damascus in Syria, not for anything she has done, but for her brother's political views.
I think one of the countries that featured most, year after year, was Syria, and that the Syrians had a particular guise, a particular interest in torture. They had devised torture techniques that I don't think we found in other countries quite as developed as it was. I remember the German chair, where people were strapped in a particular way.
I think this was happening across many parts of the world.
Yeah. I single out Syria only insofar as that we had a number of Syrian cases. They came up time and time again.
Yeah.
And the torture was always prevalent, as opposed to the torture we found everywhere in so many other countries.
Ghassan Najjar is one of 7,500 political prisoners who are detained in a Syrian jail tonight. He has been in prison near Damascus for the last 11 years. He's never been charged with any crime or brought before a court.
The Syrian case that has always stayed with me was that of Riyad al-Turk. His story was presented by Margaret Thatcher's guru, the Conservative politician Sir Keith Joseph. I remember vividly, when we recorded the programme, the look of intensity and disgust on his face.
This is an old picture, but the only one we have of Riyad al-Turk, a lawyer in his late 50s. He's been in prison in Damascus in Syria for the last 9 years for his opposition to the policies of the government.
Riyad was a lawyer and former secretary of the Syrian Communist Party. He was arrested and imprisoned in 1980 under the regime of Hafez al-Assad, the late father of the current president, Bashar.
I am assured that he had neither advocated nor practiced violence. While they were searching, they took his wife as hostage. When they caught him, reports reached his family that he was immediately tortured. 3 months later, they...
So what happened to Riyad al-Turk? I was amazed to find out that at the age of 82, he is still alive. He remains in Syria and has been filmed twice by the Syrian filmmaker Ali Atassi, and as recently as 2011, after the current uprising had begun. We spoke to Ali, who now lives in exile in Beirut, about this remarkable survivor.
I had the feeling that we should document this person, and I was scared that something can happen to him. He's a real political man, but also a real dissident, you know. He's a real fighter, and he can be very, very sweet and gentle, but in the same time he can be a very tough man.
Riyad eventually spent a total of 13 years in prison, the majority of it in solitary confinement.
When I asked him how he survived in this condition, he said that you need to do 3 things. Kill the time and not allow the time to kill you, not thinking of the exterior world, and the third is fight for your health and your food.
So what did he do to occupy his mind, to stop himself going insane? Week after week, month after month, year after year, he was given lentil soup.
شو بدي لخبز ما لخبز طلع معي إنه أنا يوم الصدف يعني شغلة أنا.
He said in Ali's documentary there were always hard little black grains left in it that he couldn't swallow, so he kept them, thousands of them. And when he was alone, he formed patterns and even pictures with these grains. It was his way of making art, which he had to destroy every time the guards came back into his cell. Riyad saw himself like a modern-day Sisyphus, the mythical Greek king forced to roll a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll down again for all eternity. Riyad spent a total of 20 years in Assad's prisons. So where is he now? Ali Atassi again.
He's hiding in Damascus, and he is active with humanitarian aid, with the helping people. He's a very low profile, but he's conscious for Syrian people. And what I hope that he will survive until Syrian uprising and the Syrian people become again free and a democratic country.
Bahrain consists of a group of small islands just off the coast of Saudi Arabia. It's been ruled for the last 200 years by the Al Khalifa family, who occupy all key government positions.
Bahrain was another of the countries in the Middle East that we covered in the series.
Political parties are banned. Hundreds of suspected political opponents have been jailed for months or even years without charge or trial. And the Emir Sheikh Isa Al Khalifa dissolved the National Assembly nearly 20 years ago.
The human rights lawyer Michael Mansfield told the story of Salah al-Khawaja. He belonged to one of the most well-known families in opposition to the Bahraini royal family. He was arrested in Saudi Arabia whilst on pilgrimage
and handed over to the authorities in Bahrain. After over a year in detention, he was finally brought to trial and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. They accused him of belonging to an illegal organisation, but what illegal organisation was never made clear, because Salah's trial, like most political trials in Bahrain, was held in secret.
He was released right before we actually went back to Bahrain in 2001, so in the late 1990s, when the new emir took over and then, of course, announced himself king afterwards.
Mariam Al-Khawaja is Salah's niece. She was living in exile in Denmark while her uncle was imprisoned in the 1980s.
He promised to release all the political prisoners and to allow people in exile to come back to Bahrain. And so he did actually release all of the political prisoners, and my uncle was one of them.
And do you remember seeing him at that time when he came out of prison?
He was there in the airport. So it was strange because all we knew of my uncle was this great man who was in prison and who paid a very high price for demanding civil rights.
I mean, there have been reported deaths in custody in Bahrain over many years, but your uncle survived.
Yes, he was tortured for some time.
Salah has become a hero in Jiao II prison, where temperatures rise above 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. There is little ventilation. He's been punished again and again for demanding better conditions, for asking for books or newspapers to read.
So after his release, Salah, along with his brother Abdul Hadi, continued to fight for human rights for the next 2 decades in Bahrain. I asked Mariam, where is her uncle now?
Right now he's in prison, again. He's a prisoner of conscience, again. In 2011, of course, when the protests started, of course inspired by the other revolutions in the other countries in the region, he was one of the people that automatically participated in the protests. And so when they started attacking people and arresting them, he was one of the first people to go. He was very violently arrested in front of his family. They put a gun to his son's head, who was only, I think, 12 years old at the time. And they threatened to shoot him if he didn't say where his father was.
Mariam has taken up the mantle of her uncle and father's work, and is now the acting president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, travelling the world campaigning on behalf of her family. Salah's brother, her father, and even her sister are now also in prison. But the centre is controversial, despite winning international awards. The Bahraini government say it is a terrorist organisation funded by Iran, an accusation that Mariam strongly denies.
Now, of course, these allegations have always existed. I've been called an Iranian agent, an Israeli agent, a U.S. agent, anything that they think might ruin my credibility. And of course, most of the time my response to that is to laugh and to say, well, if that's the case, I must be the smartest person in the world to bring those three governments together.
How long is his sentence, your uncle's sentence?
5 years imprisonment.
5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And your father's sentence?
Life imprisonment.
And your sister's sentence?
My sister, so far, it's a year. So she's supposed to be out in February 2014.
So when we made that program 20 years ago about your uncle, nothing really has changed. Nothing really has changed.
No, I would say that to a certain extent it's gotten worse.
One part of the Middle East we could not ignore was Israel and Palestine. Rabbi Julia Neuberger presented the case of Abi Natan, an Israeli peace activist.
His crime is that he went to talk to Yasser Arafat, chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Abi Natan is a remarkable eccentric who refuses to give up. He's been fighting for peace in the Middle East ever since 1966. He was born in Iran, grew up in Bombay, became a fighter pilot for the RAF, and after World War II, bought guns for the War of Independence in Palestine.
Natan was certainly a colourful character.
In the name of peace, Abi Natan has flown solo to Egypt, run a pop radio station called Voice of Peace from a converted World War II freighter anchored off Tel Aviv, been on long hunger strikes, raised money for refugees, organised peace marches, called on world leaders for their help, and even attempted to deliver 100,000 flowers from the people of Israel to the people of Egypt.
Here he is being interviewed in 1994.
Usually politicians feel that the making of peace is strictly the monopoly of politicians, and that there is no role for the individual. And throughout history, it is the individual that spoke out, created a climate that enabled politicians to change their minds and to change their policies.
Abi Natan died in Tel Aviv in 2008.
The story I am about to tell you would be an indictment of the human race at any time, Perhaps you will understand why, as an old Jew, it saddens me particularly.
The violinist Yehudi Menuhin.
Dr. Yod Yitzchak is a Palestinian and the former dean of the Faculty of Science at Bethlehem University on the West Bank. He has a PhD from the University of East Anglia.
Yehudi Menuhin, to me, was the perfect choice to tell the story of Yad Yitzhak, the Palestinian academic that we profiled in 1988.
It seems so far away 25 years ago.
We managed to track down Dr. Yitzhak in Jerusalem.
But still, the memories of those days are imprinted in my brain.
He began by telling me of the campaign of civil disobedience that led to his arrest during the Intifada, the Palestinian uprising in 1988.
He decided that it might be a good idea to try to go back to the land, to start planting their gardens, to produce the necessary food needed to their families.
From a small shed, Dr. Yitzchak gave advice about how to grow crops and vegetables, especially to the people who were out of work.
This empowered the people. They became very proud, and this was a very strong message to tell them, we do not want the occupation to continue. We want to have a free Palestine. We want you to be our good neighbors, but we don't want you as our occupiers.
Dr. Yitzchak found himself subjected to growing military harassment. His phone was cut off, soldiers parked their jeeps outside his house and spent the night revving their engines and sounding their horns.
We decided that we will have Israelis stay in Palestinian homes, and the Israelis came to Bet Sahur, about 25 families. They stayed with 25 Palestinian families in Bet Sahur. We broke the bread together. We had dinner together.
There was no violent protests?
Nothing. Not one single stone to be thrown or any violent thing to happen, not to give the army the excuse to say that we are violent people.
Why then were you arrested? What happened?
Well, there is a military order regime which says that you can put people up to 6 months for administrative detention. In other words, without showing the charges, indicating why they were arrested. And this was used against me, and I was put in jail for 6 months.
Why were you a danger to them?
Because I think the reason is that demonizing the Palestinians and labeling them as terrorists, this is the easy thing to be able to justify actions against them. But when you have somebody like me who hates even killing a fly and who adopts peaceful ways of expression, this is very dangerous because it undermines the Israeli propaganda machine that all Palestinians are genetically modified objects.
You mean programmed for terrorism?
Exactly.
The 6 months Dr. Yitzhak spent in detention, he told me, changed his life.
For me, it was a learning experience. Remember, before I was arrested, I was the Dean of Science at Bethlehem University. In other words, I was living in an ivory tower. I never got to know the grassroots, the masses, the people. But in Ansar 3, I met people from all different backgrounds. And I came to realize that there is a big gap between the university and the street. And it made me feel very close to the people.
And since his release, he has moved away from academia and dedicated his life to researching water, environment and agriculture to help increase self-reliance for the Palestinian people. I was so encouraged that Dr. Yitzhak's experience in prison had inspired him to work for human rights for his people. I wondered if it was possible to work out how much human rights have in fact improved around the world. It's another thought I put to Philippe Sands.
Well, that is the big question, isn't it? Are more people better off today in terms of their basic rights being protected, in terms of their not being mistreated? One would hope that the answer is yes. And I don't think it's a case that there's been a rise in the number of human rights abuses, but that there has been a rise in the extent of our knowledge about human rights abuses. the kinds of terrible abuses that happen in countries like Iran systematically are under the spotlight, and the authorities there have to take a little more care in relation to places like China, where we know this is a major issue. Equally, we know of certain high-profile cases where less harm has been done because of public scrutiny, and that public scrutiny is premised on a right to scrutinize because of human rights norms.
Asia was another major focus of our 5 years' worth of series of Prisoners of Conscience. In China alone, we covered 4 cases, including this one, presented by the writer A.S. Byatt.
For many years, Liao Yiwu was one of China's most popular young poets. He was published in the best journals and magazines, and he won prizes for his verse about his native Sichuan.
Liao Yiwu came into conflict with the Chinese authorities when he composed his long poem Massacre in response to the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989.
After hours of shooting and facing a line of troops, the crowd is still here. They're shouting, "Stop the killing and down with the government."
He recorded an audio version of the poem with chanting and howling, evoking the spirits of the dead.
He wrote, "The old, toothless machinery of the state rolls towards those who have the courage to resist the sickness. Ironclad professional killers swim in a sea of blood, set fire beneath tightly closed windows, wipe their army regulation boots with the skirts of dead girls."
Liao was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He then suffered many years of frustration and harassment in China. He wrote to me and said that after he was threatened in 2011 with a 10-year jail sentence because of a new collection of poems to be published outside China, he decided to escape to Germany.
We stand on a great road, but no one is able to walk. We stand in the midst of cacophony, but all are mute.
Liao Yiwu told me that after the tragic events of Tiananmen Square, he can no longer write poetry, but rather concentrates now on reportage, to be a witness for the voiceless in China. In revisiting the stories of these prisoners of conscience, I've been struck by the sheer sacrifices they've made and the personal cost to them. But there was one story, the very first story, in fact, that we told in 1988 that will always be unforgettable to me. How do I pronounce your name?
Yeah, my name is So Sung. Family name is So. First name is Sung.
Right.
Yeah.
What would you like? It's the story of So Sung. He was a student in South Korea who was arrested in 1971 for being a North Korean spy. What happened to So Sung beggars belief. It was extraordinary that I was actually talking to him 25 years on.
Pretty good, Professor Sung.
Thank you.
Why don't we try just a little in English?
No. I have been in...
The musician Sting presented his case.
So Sung agreed that he had traveled to North Korea, but explained that as a second-generation Korean living in Japan, he became interested in the idea of reuniting the two halves of Korea by peaceful means. He insisted that his visits had nothing to do with espionage. But in South Korea, all travel to the north is forbidden and punishable under the national security law.
I didn't do any action for North Koreans, but they accused me the fact I went to North Korea.
You were accused of being a spy for North Korea?
Yeah.
Spy. He was sentenced to death by the Seoul District Court. A year later, this was reduced to life imprisonment.
But before those trials began, So Sung, as well as his brother, were also charged with espionage and tortured.
My younger brother, So Jun-si, was tortured very, very cruelly and almost nearly he dead.
So he nearly died?
Died.
Now, may I ask you, and I find this very difficult to ask you, but we were told that you were in such despair that you set fire to yourself. Is that right?
Yeah. It's not in prison, in military security command. They demand me to confess. Many my friends.
So they wanted you to confess.
Yeah, and the torture was very painful. Yes. So, but I never betray my friends. Only way not to confess. Yes. Kill myself. So commit suicide.
And did you set fire to yourself?
Yeah. Only one soldier remained to watch me, but very fortunately, he went out to smoke. Almost impossible chance came to me. So then in a room was a kerosene stove. So I opened that and the fuel tank, poured oil me, so put on fire. Very, very slowly burned. So when fire come up to my face, then I cried. I shouted.
Screamed.
Screamed. So watch soldier coming and many people come to extinct the fire.
He was only able to sign this so-called confession 6 weeks later, for by then he was in hospital recovering from the extensive burns of his suicide attempt. He signed the only way he could, with the imprint of his big toe.
I can barely comprehend that So Sung survived such a trauma. 6 months later, he began his life sentence.
So my mother and the family, even there were no hope and no future, I cannot commit suicide for them.
In July 1985, after 14 years in prison, So Sung rebelled against the conditions under which he was kept, and in particular against the long periods of isolation. As a punishment, he was tied with rope, hung from the ceiling, and beaten.
It was very moving to me to actually talk to So Sung, who recovered from his injuries and in the end spent 19 years as an innocent man in jail. After his release, he went on to successfully pursue an academic career in human rights law in Japan. In his final thoughts, he said to me, "Human rights belongs to those who demand it. It's like air or water. Where it's in abundance, you don't even think about it." Of course, some of the original prisoners of conscience we were not able to find, because at the time they were disappeared, and remain so.
The story of Tarcisio, a 21-year-old student in Colombia, is only too familiar for many Latin Americans today. The last time Tarcisio was seen was on the night of February the 19th, 1988. He was being led into F2, the notorious police intelligence section in the city of Neiva in central Colombia. Since then, he has quite simply disappeared.
We featured stories particularly from Central and South America, where state-sponsored kidnappings and disappearances were rife.
At 10 o'clock that morning, Hihio, as he is known, and 4 other street children were drinking coffee in a parking lot when a new black car with private license plates and darkened windows drew up beside them. 4 armed men dressed in cowboy shirts and wearing sunglasses got out, seized them and bundled them into the car.
Even though we knew it was highly unlikely that these people would be found alive, we still wanted to highlight this murderous tool of repressive regimes.
Ernesto, who is a bus driver and a fisherman, is one of Cuba's last plantados, that is to say political prisoners, famous for their unyielding defiance.
We have found one case from Latin America who was not disappeared. The Cuban poet Ernesto Diaz Rodriguez, who had been in prison for 22 years, when the conductor, Vladimir Ashkenazi, presented his story.
This is the most recent picture we have, smuggled out of prison. He spends his time carving fine jewelry out of bits of stone and wood, and has composed a book of poems for his sons, which are neither angry nor bitter.
We found Ernesto, who now lives in the US.
Ernesto was a former comrade of Fidel Castro, who became so disillusioned with the revolution that he left Cuba to become involved with the political opposition in exile in America.
But he was arrested after a secret trip to Cuba. While in prison, he was tortured, suffered terrible conditions, and went on prolonged hunger strikes. He said he was ready to die, and that in dying for the freedom of the Cuban people, it would save his soul. He told me that while he was in prison, his struggle was one of non-violence. He was fighting with his pen. However, after his release, he joined a group of American-based Cuban counter-revolutionaries called Alpha 66, based in Miami.
This is a dad's army with deadly intent.
ABC Australia's report on Alpha 66, made in 1997.
In 1961, Fidel Castro smashed a CIA-trained invasion force of Cuban exiles in a debacle that became known as the Bay of Pigs. The survivors retreated to the Florida Everglades to form this group, Alpha 66.
Ernesto, I have seen videos of Alpha 66 where paramilitaries are training, people are firing weapons. Alpha 66 looks to me like a paramilitary organization prepared to use violence at some time on the Cuban mainland to achieve their goals of getting rid of the Castro regime. Now, it seems to me, from listening to you carefully, you have come to a position where this is a possibility for you, in a way that it would not have been many years ago in prison. Am I correct?
Déjeme explicarle a ver si puedo hacerme entender. Alpha 66.
He insisted that Alpha 66 had not been involved in any offensive action against the communist government in Cuba. They have also dissolved their military camp. He said the men of Alpha 66 are ready to join with the Cuban people if they decide to use force to regain their freedom in Cuba.
Por la fuerza, a base de terror, para que encuentren la solución.
Looking back, Ernesto's case made me question if some of the prisoners of conscience did not entirely espouse nonviolence in their struggle to change the societies they lived in. After 5 years, we knew that 2/3 of the 62 prisoners of conscience we had featured had been released. So what's changed? According to the Secretary-General of Amnesty International, Salil Shetty, there are still many thousands of other prisoners of conscience in the world today.
The big shift, I would say, that's happened is that, and we've seen this, of course, in the Arab Spring, but it's happening across many countries, including in China, where we hear less about these things, which is people standing up for their own rights, people standing up and not relying on external support, which is amazing. They're taking huge personal risk.
Yeah, it still needs courage, doesn't it, to stand out?
And I was absolutely...
And to say, look, I'm not going to tolerate this. I've got to try and change things. I've got to say what I feel. I've got to say what I believe.
At the heart of it, it's people's conviction and their belief and their passion, and there's no shortcut to it. We have to acknowledge that social media has been very important in helping people organize, and without question, it also has provided a degree of anonymity. So a lot of the street protests, etc., have happened thanks to Twitter and Facebook. But I always say that in the end, the people who put their bodies in front of the tank in Tahrir Square were human beings. It wasn't a tweet or a Facebook post, because that's the human courage, and there's no shortcut to that.
I went on to make subsequent programs on human rights for the BBC till the year 2000. September 11th, 2001.
And we're getting reports of a plane crash in the World Trade Center in New York. You can see the pictures there. It's one of New York.
I was at the base of the building when it happened. There was one huge bang and the building physically shook.
the beginning of the war on terror, of extraordinary rendition, the abuses of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay.
A world where freedom itself is under attack.
I wonder to what extent these events have impacted on human rights, and on prisoners of conscience in particular. Academic and human rights lawyer Philippe Sands.
I think there's been a terrible fallout of the events after September the 11th. I think we've lost trust in government. Western governments, very sadly, have lost their ability to lecture others on the violation of human rights standards. And that, I think, is regrettable. I mean, no country has ever been perfect, but in order to point your finger at the houses of others, your own house has to be pretty much in order. So a British government bleating on about withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights or shredding the Human Rights Act is not helpful if you're trying to get other countries with far worse human rights situations, frankly, to get their houses in order.
Do you have any examples of Western NGOs trying to work on behalf of other prisoners of conscience around the world and being told, look, why should we listen to you? Your word is meaningless.
I have had meetings with a president, with a prime minister or foreign minister of a country that is a serial human rights abuser, in which that individual will have said to me, well, I don't have to take lessons anymore from the Americans or the British about standards of definition of torture or treatment of detainees on these issues. So what has happened is, by our own governments having adopted positions that are really pretty poor, it's made it much easier for other governments, who frankly are the serial human rights abusers, to turn around and say, we're simply applying the same standards that you're applying. Go away, bug off, leave us alone.
I'm sure there will always be people concerned enough to want to do something for those falsely accused, unjustly imprisoned, and ill-treated wherever they are in the world. We tried in our series of Prisoners of Conscience to do just that, to use the medium of television to bring attention to just 62 people out of thousands. I realized in talking to a few of them that even if they didn't hear about their particular program at the time, at least they were not forgotten. It meant something to them, just as it meant something to me. As we've heard, the abuse of human rights stays with us. So let us end with one more case. Dr. Nguyen Dan Quay was an Amnesty prisoner of conscience in 1992. He is still one today. His story at the time was presented by Sebastian Coe.
Dr. Nguyen Dan Quay has fought for human rights all his life. He is a distinguished doctor from a small town south of Hanoi in Vietnam. Tonight he is in a prison in Saigon with a bleeding duodenal ulcer. He has neither been charged with any crime nor given a trial.
He explained in the program how Dr. Quay had first been imprisoned as far back as 1978 after publicly criticizing the communist regime about the lack of human rights in Vietnam.
He was taken to Ho Chi Minh City and tortured, and then put in a cell measuring 2 meters by 1, with a hole for air. He was given barely enough food to survive. He remained defiant, and we know he told his interrogators, "I have nothing to reconsider. A lot of people have believed in me. I simply will never surrender my beliefs, and I will never stop fighting for them."
Dr. Quay spent a total of 20 years in prison and was finally released in 1998. He hasn't been allowed to practice medicine since then, but has continued his struggle for human rights and democracy in Vietnam. We were able to find him in Saigon, having been told that he's still having considerable problems with the authorities. Tell me, Dr. Quay, we were told that we should not send a Vietnamese person to record this interview with you today. Why is that, do you think?
I am actually right now under surveillance. There are police outside the house at this moment.
There are police outside your house at this moment?
Yes, many,
Can you see them?
Yes, I see them, and I know them too,
You know them because you see them all the time, is that it?
Yes, many times,
How does it feel to you to be under surveillance like this?
Very uneasy, I always feel very uneasy.
Why are these people watching you? Why are you under surveillance?
Because in Vietnam, they always try to keep an eye on the human rights activists. They don't want change, true change. We want to establish true democracy from bottom upward. The secret police in plain clothes always keep an eye on me, harass me, threaten me, even created accidents on the road, or any time they can intrude in my house to confiscate my computer.
So, Dr. Quay, you cannot work, you cannot express your opinions, you are virtually under house arrest. You are still, in a way, a prisoner, except that you're not in a jail.
Yes, that's right. A prisoner at home. Exactly like a prisoner, but not in the prison, but my home is a prison.
Now, Dr. Quay, when our conversation is broadcast on the BBC, do you think this will make your life more dangerous? Do you think your making this phone call with me could actually lead to your arrest?
Well, we never know, Mr. Rick Bloomstein. I am not afraid at all, so continue, because that is a part of our struggle. But what I can tell you, we have to accept any risk. Don't worry about that. Go on. And it depends on them.